Holy fucking hell. That was my first thought, my only thought, as four men in what looked suspiciously like paramilitary gear burst in my bedroom at some ungodly hour. Their vests screamed, HOA enforcement, a detail that felt utterly ludicrous given the circumstances. Federal badges, gleaming under the harsh light of their tactical flashlights, were flashed in my face like some kind of twisted game of poker. Neighborhood safety violation, Mr. Henderson. One of them barked, his voice tight with what I assumed was practiced authority. You're non-compliant. We're here to seize your firearm collection. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm that echoed the unsettling dread creeping into my very bones. This wasn't some sleepy-eyed HOA dispute over overgrown hedges. These weren't your average neighborhood watch patrolmen. These were operators, professionals, moving with a chilling efficiency that sent shivers down my spine. The gear they wore, black tactical vests, assault rifles slung casually over their shoulders, the glint of specialized equipment strapped to their belts, was more appropriate for a military raid than a quiet suburban community. In the middle of the night, timing? That was the icing on this truly terrifying cake. The audacity, the sheer unadulterated nerve of it all. The blood drained from my face as they advanced towards my gun room, their movements precise and coordinated. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home, surrounded by heavily armed strangers who claimed legal authority, but who reeked of something far more sinister. I'm a firm believer in following the law. Always have been. I've never wanted trouble. But this was beyond any reasonable explanation. This smelled like a setup, a carefully orchestrated ambush. My gun room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. It had been my refuge since the death of my beloved wife, Eleanor, 8 months prior. Each weapon, meticulously cleaned and cataloged, stood as a testament to years spent mastering the art of marksmanship. The room itself was a reflection of my disciplined nature. Every metal component arranged with the precision of a surgeon, a military precision that would have impressed even the most seasoned drill sergeant. The air itself seemed charged with the history of a lifetime's passion. But something was wrong. Terribly, undeniably wrong. Eleanor's father's Purple Heart, a cherished symbol of his service in Normandy, had been moved. 3 inches to the left, to be exact. A seemingly insignificant detail, yet the kind of detail that clawed at my sanity. And the digital lock on my gun safe? It displayed 4 failed entry attempts overnight. For attempts made by someone who clearly knew the combination, but couldn't quite get it right. I've handled firearms for over 4 decades. I'm not just intimately familiar with them. I've made a life study out of understanding the intricate balance between their power and their potential for danger. And when you're a grieving widower living alone in any neighborhood, but particularly in a quiet, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood like mine, you notice these things. You notice when things are out of place. Grief, in its cruel way, magnifies even the smallest anomalies, transforming them into shadows of doubt and suspicion. Eleanor's father's Purple Heart and his well-worn M1 Garand. These weren't just possessions. They were heirlooms, sacred tokens of a legacy that stretched back generations. They represented the values my family lived by: courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to defending freedom. They were much more than inanimate objects. They held the weight of untold sacrifices, of heroism in the face of unimaginable horror. They were the embodiment of our shared history and our enduring connection to those who had fought and died for their country. These artifacts weren't just my possessions. They were sacred trust, a responsibility that fell to me after Eleanor's passing. They were also the only tangible reminders of our connection, the only way I felt I could truly maintain our connection. Eleanor used to tease me about spending more time polishing those old medals than I did with her. But now, in my solitude, they were the only conversation I still had with her. They carried her ghost within them. Someone, it seemed, was attempting to silence that conversation. The burning question wasn't simply who had violated my privacy. It was how long they had been watching me, observing my vulnerability, exploiting my grief. This wasn't a simple burglary. This was a calculated invasion, a chilling intrusion into the most sacred parts of my life. This was personal. This felt like a direct attack upon my memory of Eleanor. The feeling of violation, of profound betrayal, was a heavy weight upon my chest. Later that day, while wrestling with the unnerving implications of the night's events, a knock echoed at my front door. I cautiously opened it to find a man, perhaps in his mid-40s, neatly dressed and sporting a Support Our Troops baseball cap. He held a casserole dish, a gesture of unexpected kindness that felt completely out of place given the circumstances. "Mr. Henderson," he said, offering a friendly smile, "I'm Edward Reyes, your new neighbor from 3 houses down. I heard about Eleanor's passing and wanted to introduce myself properly." Edward's presence felt like a beacon in an ocean of cold indifference. For 8 long months, my neighbors had avoided me, treating me like a leper, like my grief was some kind of contagion to be avoided. His gesture, while seemingly simple, felt revolutionary. It was exactly what I needed at that exact moment. A connection, a recognition of my shared history in the military and understanding of my loss. A godsend, a true form of divine intervention. Edward's understanding, as a fellow veteran, cut through the dense fog of grief that had cloaked me since Eleanor's passing. He grasped the unspoken language of military life, the intricacies of military protocols, the emotional weight of loss. He understood why I kept my weapons so meticulously organized, why Eleanor's father's service memorabilia held a profound significance, and why losing a spouse after decades of shared military experience felt like a loss far greater than the sum of its parts. The loss, to him, was understandable, not something to be avoided. Within minutes of our meeting, he was asking insightful questions about proper firearm storage, showing a genuine interest in my military collectibles. His questions, however, were far more pointed than what I initially realized. "That's quite a collection you must have, Frank," he said, his gaze drifting towards my gunroom. "I'd love to hear some of the stories behind those pieces sometime. History like that deserves to be preserved properly." That's when the first red flag should have gone up. Edward's vocabulary transcended the casual knowledge of a typical veteran. He used the terminology of a seasoned military antique specialist, effortlessly dropping phrases like provenance documentation and authentication standards. It wasn't the casual conversation of a neighbor trying to offer condolences. It was the careful probing of someone with an agenda. When I showed him Eleanor's father's Purple Heart display, his eyes gleamed with an intensity that went beyond mere patriotic respect. It was the concentrated focus of someone appraising a valuable asset, a collector examining a rare artifact. "That Normandy Purple Heart, Frank," he said, meticulously examining the case. "Have you considered upgrading your home security? With valuable pieces like this, you want to make sure everything's properly protected. I know some guys who could help with professional installation, discreet military-grade stuff that won't make your home look like Fort Knox." Looking back, I can see now that Edward's questions followed a systematic pattern, the calculated precision of an intelligence officer. First, he assessed value, casually inquiring about historical significance and market worth. Then, he probed authentication, wanting to know how I verified authenticity and maintained documentation. Next came security vulnerabilities, my storage methods, alarm systems, and daily routines. Finally, he inquired about insurance coverage. What would happen if something unfortunate were to occur to my collection? At the time, his questions felt like genuine concern from a fellow veteran, a brother-in-arms who understood the weight of my losses. In reality, they were a meticulously crafted reconnaissance mission disguised as friendly neighborly conversation. I, in my grief, was too desperate for companionship, too eager for normalcy, to see the intelligence gathering happening directly under my nose. That night, determined to uncover the truth behind the attempted safe break-in, I reviewed my security footage. What I saw sent a fresh wave of icy fear through me, a cold that mirrored the fear of my first combat deployment. At 2:17 a.m., 3 days before Edward's visit, a figure had been in my gunroom, using a flashlight to methodically photograph Eleanor's father's Purple Heart case and measure the display positions with the precision of a seasoned professional thief. The intruder's movements were deliberate, efficient. He documented serial numbers on my firearms and meticulously photographed my security system from multiple angles, ensuring he had a complete understanding of my defenses. This wasn't some random burglar. This was a planned, professional operation. Holy goddamn hellfire. That was my first thought, staring at the grainy security footage. It wasn't just a break-in. It was surgical. The precision, the calculated movements. It screamed of someone who knew my house better than I did, someone who'd spent countless hours studying my routines, my vulnerabilities, my very soul. This wasn't some opportunistic burglar. This was a targeted attack. The chilling realization hit me harder than any mortar blast ever had. A stark reminder of my own mortality and the brutal truth that I was once again embroiled in a conflict I desperately wanted to avoid. The image of those gloved hands, expertly navigating my gun's safe, burned into my retinas, each second a fresh wound on the raw flesh of my grief. It was a methodical, almost artistic dismantling of my carefully guarded past, a past which, I now realized, was being weaponized against me. The question wasn't if Daniel, or whatever his real name was involved. It was the horrifying depth of his planning. How long had he been observing me, subtly infiltrating my life? Months, maybe? I shivered. How much had I revealed? Months ago, I still wore the scars of my loss. My widowhood had left a hollow ache, a gaping wound in the fabric of my existence. The world was a muted gray, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors that Martha, my wife, had brought to my life. That silence, that suffocating loneliness, made me an easy target, a ripe plum for this predator. The way he'd insinuated himself into my life, it was insidious. He was like a skilled hunter, slowly closing the distance. First, he was just a friendly face, a neighbor, always eager to lend a hand. Then, he was the brother in arms, sharing stories from his so-called time in Afghanistan. Stories laced with just enough detail to appear authentic, just enough combat jargon to lull my suspicions. It wasn't just the way he spoke, it was the way he listened, hanging on to my every word about Martha, about my military service, about my father-in-law's legacy. I'd been craving connection, a desperate need for someone who understood the unique bonds of military life, the shared trauma, the quiet camaraderie, and he'd given me exactly that, a carefully constructed illusion of understanding. His perfectly timed arrival after Martha's passing was chillingly calculated. My isolation, my grief, they were his weapons. He knew that the soldier's life of discipline and precision wouldn't be matched by my civilian self. He expertly exploited my vulnerabilities, playing on my emotional need for companionship and understanding. He'd arrive with groceries, fix minor household repairs, sharing stories that he'd meticulously constructed. Those tales weren't just anecdotes. They were calculated moves designed to build trust, to create a bond strong enough to lower my defenses. The shared details about military life, about fighting in Afghanistan. These weren't just charming stories. They were data points, intelligence gathering in disguise. He described the deafening roar of incoming mortars with such chilling realism, the way the fine desert sand infiltrated everything, the bonds forged between soldiers facing death together. Every carefully crafted detail seemed to draw us together. But the true mastery of his manipulation came in his profound interest in my late father-in-law's military history. He treated the old man's Purple Heart not merely as a medal, but as a sacred relic, a testament to the sacrifices made for their country. He spoke of it with reverence, with emotion that seemed genuine, making me believe I'd finally found someone who valued my family history as much as I did. He'd spend hours poring over photographs, asking detailed questions about the 116th Infantry Regiment's role in the D-Day landings, the specific challenges of fighting on Omaha Beach, almost as if he was conducting a meticulous historical study. Men like your father-in-law, Daniel would say, his voice full of a genuine seeming emotion, are the reason we have the freedom to live in neighborhoods like this. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored properly, not hidden away where nobody can appreciate what they did for our country. The words were perfectly calibrated to strike a chord within my grieving heart, the precise words to soothe my pain, my loneliness. He'd become my confidant, my friend, the son I never had, the brother I'd lost when my unit disbanded. But the chilling truth was that every moment of shared camaraderie was a step closer to something far more sinister. He was systematically mapping my house, studying my routines. When he offered to help organize my gun collection, a collection representing a lifetime of military history, I never suspected that this was a calculated play. "Frank," he'd say, his voice dripping with concern, "with all these valuable pieces, have you thought about upgrading your security system? Something that could alert you immediately if someone tries to access your collection?" These seemingly benign questions were, in reality, part of a highly sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. His questions mirrored the interrogation techniques I'd used in the Army, a systematic deconstruction of my defenses. He was learning my weaknesses, identifying the most valuable targets. When he suggested I document everything for insurance purposes, offering to help photograph and catalog my collection, it seemed like a kind gesture. The reality was far more chilling. He was creating a detailed shopping list for his employers, a list of highly valuable military artifacts, each item meticulously documented, each detail a stepping stone towards his ultimate goal. The way he examined my father-in-law's Purple Heart, it wasn't the respectful gaze of a fellow veteran. It was the cold, analytical scrutiny of an appraiser. Every casual question about authentication procedures, every seemingly helpful suggestion about security improvements, every shared moment of military brotherhood, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plot, meticulously designed to exploit my vulnerability and my trust. I should have seen the red flags. His knowledge of military collectibles far surpassed any ordinary veteran. He knew specifics about manufacturers, historical markers, and market values, suggesting a level of expertise beyond casual interest. It wasn't just knowledge. It was expertise honed through years of professional study and practice, the kind you wouldn't acquire from casually browsing military memorabilia shops. His analytical "I wasn't just inspecting relics. He was assessing their value, their potential for profit." His detailed photographs of the Purple Heart were more than just a sentimental gesture. It was part of a comprehensive plan of acquisition. Then came the photograph. I was making coffee, my mind adrift in thought, when I saw him, phone in hand, meticulously documenting my father-in-law's Purple Heart display. Not a casual snapshot, but carefully composed shots from different angles, close-ups of authentication markings, serial numbers, the act of a professional, not a nephew, showing off family history. When I asked about it, his explanation was smooth, practiced. "My nephew's doing a school project," he'd said, his voice reassuring, his smile carefully crafted. "And I thought your father-in-law's story would make a real impact." It sounded reasonable, believable, until I spoke to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "It's so nice that your friend Daniel doesn't have children," she said. "Makes it easier for him to spend time helping you adjust." That single comment, that casual remark about Daniel's supposed lack of family, shattered my carefully constructed world. It was either a lie, a deliberate deception, or Mrs. Patterson was mistaken. Either way, it was a cruel betrayal of the fragile trust one had foolishly placed in him. That night, the weight of betrayal pressed down on me. The cold certainty of having been expertly manipulated cutting through the numbness of my grief. My anger started to boil, a volcanic force threatening to erupt and consume the charade of friendship. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't just a grieving widower. I was a soldier, and I would fight for justice, for my wife's memory, for the honor of my father-in-law's sacrifice. This wasn't just about stolen artifacts. It was about a systematic invasion of my life, my privacy, my very soul. The hunt was on. "Son of a bitch," Arthur muttered, slamming his fist on the kitchen table, the clatter echoing in the unsettling silence of his otherwise meticulously organized home. The photograph of Evelyn, his late wife, sat on the counter. a stark reminder of the emptiness that had swallowed him whole after her passing. He stared at it, his eyes tracing the lines of her familiar smile, a ghost of a woman he'd loved with a fierceness that bordered on obsession. It was that very fierce love, that desperate need for connection after her death, that had blinded him. A creeping unease had been gnawing at him for weeks. It wasn't a sudden revelation, more like a slow, insidious poison seeping into his consciousness, starting with the seemingly harmless inconsistencies surrounding his new friend, Daniel. The whole photography episode, a casual mention of a rare shot of Evelyn at a military function, a photo Daniel claimed he'd found in a local antique store, felt off. The non-existent nephew, the one who supposedly knew everything about military memorabilia, the strangely detailed knowledge Daniel possessed of his vast collection. These weren't isolated incidents. They formed a disturbing pattern. His years of military intelligence training, dormant yet not forgotten, screamed warning signals. Arthur ran a hand through his thinning hair, replaying his conversations with Daniel. The subtle ways Daniel guided their discussions towards the value of his collection. The ease with which Daniel seemed to have integrated himself into his daily life, observing his routines without Arthur's conscious awareness. It all felt calculated, premeditated. It was like watching a replay of a meticulously planned military operation, a stealthy incursion into the vulnerable landscape of his grief. The worst wasn't the horrifying realization that Daniel might be manipulating him. It was the agonizing truth of how desperately he had needed to believe in their friendship. After Evelyn's death, the world had felt stark, cold, utterly devoid of warmth. He'd been adrift in a sea of sorrow, desperately clutching at any life raft. Daniel, with his genuine seeming interest in military history and his outwardly empathetic nature, had presented himself as the perfect life raft. He'd filled the cavernous void left by Evelyn's passing with a deceptive sense of camaraderie, and Arthur, blinded by grief and loneliness, had swallowed it whole, ignoring the glaring inconsistencies and swallowing Daniel's convenient explanations like a starving man gobbling down a poisoned loaf of bread. He had accepted implausible narratives without a second thought, explanations that wouldn't fool a fresh-faced recruit at basic training. The weight of his realization pressed down on him. He'd been a target, a soft mark, vulnerable because of his grief. The sharp sting of betrayal mingled with the bitter taste of self-reproach. He'd been so consumed by his sorrow that he'd failed to see the signs, to recognize the manipulations. He sat there in the quiet kitchen, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the suffocating dread of the present. He stared at Evelyn's photograph, the grief a heavy cloak around him. Could he trust anyone? The question gnawed at him, a relentless, corrosive force. How far would he let this go before he fought back, before he reclaimed his strength, before he rekindled the soldier within, the one who never backed down from fight? The following morning, as if the universe had decided to throw another punch, Deborah Miller, the HOA president, arrived at his doorstep. She carried a bouquet of lilies, their white petals a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled in Arthur's soul. She wore her HOA president badge with an almost militaristic precision, a chilling imitation of the regalia he'd once donned with pride. He'd lived in Oakwood Estates for 2 years, and his interactions with Deborah had been minimal, polite nods across the street. Yet, here she was, appearing almost perfectly composed, her appearance like a perfectly staged scene from a glossy home improvement magazine, even at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Arthur," Deborah said, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy, "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. I wanted to give you space to grieve, but I thought perhaps some fresh flowers might brighten your home. Evelyn always had such lovely gardens." The shift in conversation was jarring, a sudden transition from condolences to community concerns. In 90 seconds of expressing her sympathy, she'd skillfully redirected the conversation towards his military collection and the adequacy of his insurance coverage. "We've had concerns from residents about security in the area, Arthur," Deborah continued, her tone subtly shifting. "With all the military memorabilia and firearms you have, Have you considered updating your homeowner's policy? For everyone's protection, of course. We want to ensure everyone is safe should something unfortunate happen. The veiled threat was unmistakable, a thinly disguised attempt to pressure him. Her words were dripping with the same manipulative saccharine tone he remembered from dealing with insurance adjusters following Evelyn's prolonged illness and subsequent passing. What followed was a calculated campaign of subtle harassment. Deborah's visits became increasingly frequent, each one carefully orchestrated. She'd bring casseroles, community newsletters, always finding ways to steer the conversations towards his gun room and the intricacies of HOA regulations regarding valuable possessions. With each visit, she'd skillfully raise new, carefully crafted neighborhood concerns about liability and property values, subtly implying that his military collection was somehow jeopardizing the community. Arthur, I hope you understand, as HOA president, I must consider everyone's welfare, Deborah insisted. Some neighbors have expressed concerns about having so many weapons in a residential area. Perhaps we could discuss some security upgrades? To put everyone's minds at ease. The pressure intensified, the subtle suggestions morphing into thinly veiled accusations. The climax arrived when Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting specifically addressing firearm storage safety concerns. Arthur, who'd never once attended an HOA meeting in the 2 years he'd lived there, found himself drawn to this one, pulled by an instinctual need to confront the insidious threat. What he encountered was a carefully staged ambush, a public trial designed to portray him as a menace to the community. Deborah was fully prepared, presenting charts demonstrating inflated property insurance rates and frightening statistics regarding accidents involving unsecured military collections. She positioned herself as the reasonable voice of reason, the protector of the community from his supposedly reckless weapon storage. The meeting was a microcosm of the community itself, split into predictable factions. Deborah's supporters, many of whom hadn't acknowledged Arthur's presence before, focused on property values and insurance premiums, arguing that the presence of a substantial firearms collection in a residential neighborhood posed an unacceptable risk. We're not anti-military, one woman insisted, her voice tight with a carefully constructed air of concern, but we have children playing in these streets. What if something happened? What if there was a break-in and those weapons ended up in the wrong hands? On the other side were the veterans and older residents who'd known Evelyn, defending Arthur's right to his collection, questioning the sudden urgency of the issue after 2 years of peaceful coexistence. Among them was Mrs. Gable, an unexpected ally. She stood during the public comment period and delivered a fiery speech, a counteroffensive against Deborah's meticulously planned attack. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, Mrs. Gable declared, her voice clear and strong. And Arthur Morrison has been the most respectful, law-abiding resident we've ever had. His military collection is properly secured, legally owned, and represents a family legacy that deserves respect, not harassment. What's really interesting to me is why Deborah Miller suddenly cares so much about Arthur's property after completely ignoring him until his wife passed away. This looks less like community safety and more like targeting a grieving widower when he's most vulnerable. The meeting ended in a tumultuous haze of accusations and counter-accusations. Yet, it was the events after the meeting that would finally unravel the truth. As Arthur walked towards his truck, he overheard Deborah on her phone, her voice sharp and devoid of the practiced sympathy she'd displayed at the meeting. He heard her mention a substantial reward and a clear path to acquiring the collection. The words hung in the air, chilling him to the bone. The pieces of the puzzle, previously scattered and confusing, suddenly clicked into place. Daniel and Deborah were in cahoots, their carefully constructed charade designed to seize his collection. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game. The gentle hum of his refrigerator seemed to mock him now, a background soundtrack to the rising storm of his righteous fury. The quiet old man was gone, replaced by a soldier, ready for battle. This wasn't just about his collection anymore. It was about justice, about exposing the cruel opportunists who had preyed on his grief. The fight had begun. "Holy goddamn hellfire," I muttered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The scene unfolding before me in the parking lot was a gut punch, a betrayal so insidious it felt like a slow-acting poison. There, Eleanor, the hyper-vigilant HOA president, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, stood by her car, phone pressed to her ear, seemingly oblivious to my presence. Her voice, crisp and precise, carried on the evening breeze. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she was saying, the name a venomous whisper against the quiet hum of the suburban night. "Yes, the Purple Heart, confirmed authentic Normandy campaign, full combat documentation. The M1 Garand, service provenance verified. The client, Mr. Sterling, insists these alone justify the investment. Delivery within 60 days, provided we secure the necessary federal paperwork to keep it legitimate." The carefully chosen words, the calculated pauses, sent a cold shiver down my spine. The casual way she spoke about my late wife's father's war medals, as if they were mere commodities in a transaction, felt like a desecration. The moment she caught sight of me, the conversation abruptly ended. But the damage, irreversible. Eleanor wasn't just a zealous HOA president concerned about neighborhood aesthetics and property values, a role she played with such ruthless efficiency, subtly isolating me from my fellow residents. No, she was a pawn, a carefully placed piece in a much larger, far more sinister game. She was actively colluding with a man named Sterling, a man who was clearly prepared to go to any lengths to acquire these artifacts, these precious relics from a life I was still desperately trying to make peace with. The pieces, once scattered, now clicked into place with agonizing clarity. There was Mark, his seemingly harmless friendship, a carefully constructed reconnaissance mission disguised as neighborly concern. His casual questions about my collection, his feigned interest in my late wife's military background, his almost unsettling understanding of military culture, had all been calculated ploys designed to extract information. He'd wormed his way into my life, subtly probing for weaknesses, vulnerabilities. The random break-in 3 days before Mark's appearance was no coincidence. It was a test, a precursor to the systematic pressure campaign to follow. This wasn't random harassment by overzealous busybodies. It was a carefully orchestrated operation, a targeted assault on my grief and my sense of belonging, designed to dispossess me of the most valued possessions in my life. Then there was the relentless pressure from Eleanor, utilizing the HOA's authority as a weapon. Every minor infraction, real or imagined, every seemingly innocuous violation of the community rules, had been meticulously documented and used as ammunition against me, creating a sense of isolation that further eroded my defenses. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation and legal pressure that was chipping away at my resolve. They'd identified me, a recently widowed veteran, still reeling from grief, isolated, and vulnerable, as the perfect target. They'd studied my weaknesses, my emotional triggers. They'd painstakingly analyzed my patterns, building a multi-pronged attack designed to elicit my voluntary surrender. Mar provided the emotional manipulation and inside intelligence, gathering data on my daily routines, my emotional state, my security measures. Eleanor provided the legal pressure, leveraging the authority of the HOA to create a suffocating environment, isolating me from any sense of community support. And this shadowy Sterling figure was the orchestrator, the shadowy client providing the funding and the motivation, the puppet master pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They transformed my quiet suburban neighborhood into a hostile battlefield, using my grief and military heritage, things I held sacred, as weapons. They'd weaponized my respect for military traditions and exploited a lonely old soldier's desperate need for human connection. They saw my vulnerability, my grief, and used it like a laser-guided missile. But what they didn't understand, what they utterly failed to grasp, was the core of a career military man. We don't surrender. Not to superior numbers, not to cunning tactics, not to emotional manipulation. We adapt, we analyze, and we fight back. 40 years of Army training, 40 years honing the skills of survival were now my weapons. Karen's parking lot confession activated my muscle memory, awakening instincts long dormant since my retirement. This was a neighborhood harassment. This was enemy intelligence gathering, and it was time for counterintelligence. The first rule of defeating infiltration is controlling the information flow. My military intelligence training kicked in. I would test Mark's loyalty using techniques learned during my long career. Techniques honed on the battlefields and the clandestine world of espionage. I'd feed him false information, track its dissemination, and expose his treachery. I started small, weaving deceptive narratives into our conversations. During one of Mark's friendly visits, I casually mentioned acquiring a Civil War pistol at an estate sale, planning to have it appraised the following Tuesday by a specialist from Cleveland. Pure fiction. But Mark's reaction was telling. His eyes lit up with the same predatory gleam I'd seen when he'd first examined Martha's father's Purple Heart. He peppered me with questions about authentication, about estimated value, a hunger for detail that betrayed his true intentions. Within 24 hours, I received an HOA violation notice from Eleanor. Resident reported unusual vehicle traffic and potential commercial activity at your residence. Explanation required immediately, or face community fines. The pattern repeated itself. I mentioned installing new motion sensors in my gun room. Elaborate details about the security company, installation timeline. The next morning, a letter arrived from Eleanor regarding unpermitted security modifications. When I mentioned a fictitious federal firearms inspection, Eleanor called the next day, inquiring about government agents visiting residential properties. Each piece of false information I fed Mark resulted in immediate and targeted harassment from Eleanor, proving that Mark was feeding intelligence to his accomplice. The connection was undeniable, the betrayal absolute. The most chilling discovery came accidentally, during the mundane act of washing Mark's coffee mug. Underneath, a tiny electronic device, the size of a hearing aid battery, adhered to the ceramic. Initially, I assumed a medical device, a misplaced hearing aid component, but closer examination revealed its true nature, a sophisticated surveillance device professionally installed, designed to be undetectable. Mark hadn't merely been asking questions. He'd been meticulously recording our conversations, transmitting everything to whoever was orchestrating this campaign against me. His uncanny timing, his ability to anticipate my needs, his perfectly chosen words, all of it suddenly made horrifying sense. He had been monitoring my private moments, learning my triggers, reporting my psychological state, treating me like a high-value intelligence asset. Every conversation about Martha's death, every moment of vulnerability, every detail about my daily habits and security concerns, everything had been meticulously documented and analyzed, used to manipulate and exploit me. This wasn't theft. This was emotional warfare. This was a calculated attack on my grief, on my sense of self, on my very identity. It was a violation far deeper than any material loss could ever represent. The next week was consumed by research into Mr. Sterling, the shadowy figure behind this entire operation. Online, Sterling Federal Acquisitions appeared legitimate, a reputable military antique business specializing in estate services, historical preservation. High-end World War II collections, testimonials from satisfied clients, a veneer of respectability masking a predatory core. Yet, something was amiss. Something gnawed at my gut, a deep-seated unease telling me that this pristine facade masked something far darker. This wasn't just about acquiring military artifacts. This was about something much larger, something far more sinister. "Holy goddamn hellfire," Arthur muttered, the words a low growl rumbling from deep within his chest. The meticulously crafted business address and licensing information for Blackwood's museum, a blatant attempt to appear legitimate while sidestepping any real governmental scrutiny, felt like a slap in the face. Every detail screamed deception, a meticulously orchestrated charade designed to lull the unwary into a false sense of security. The more Arthur delved into Blackwood's murky past, the more intricate and disturbing the web of deceit became. This wasn't just some shady antique dealer trying to fleece a heartbroken widow. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise, a well-oiled machine expertly utilizing forged documents and faux officialdom to mask their larceny. The sheer audacity of it all made his blood boil. Their operation was a carefully constructed illusion, a mirage shimmering in the desert of legality. The lack of a physical storefront, despite the claims of housing a private museum, was a glaring red flag. How could they operate without a tangible location? The non-existent employee records, aside from Blackwood himself, further solidified Arthur's suspicions. This was no legitimate business. This was a phantom operation, a ghost in the machine of legitimate commerce. Even the online customer reviews, effusive, overly positive, and suspiciously generic, felt like they had been generated by an algorithm, not penned by genuine patrons. Each glowing review felt like a carefully placed stepping stone on a path leading away from the truth, a deliberate effort to obscure the sinister nature of their activities. When Arthur, using a borrowed cell phone, finally called the number listed on their website, he was met not with the pleasant tones of a museum curator, but with a response steeped in military jargon and impenetrable federal regulatory language. It sounded less like a conversation with a human being and more like a recording, a robotic recitation of scripted responses. The individual on the other end was clearly adhering to a predetermined protocol, responding in a manner that was both impersonal and unervingly precise. This wasn't the haphazard operation of a lone swindler. This was a professional organization operating with the precision and discipline of a well-trained military unit. The chilling reality sunk in. This wasn't a petty theft. This was a highly organized criminal conspiracy. This was the moment Arthur, a man who preferred peace and quiet, decided enough was enough. He played defense for too long, patiently gathering evidence, meticulously documenting every suspicious move. Now, it was time to go on the offensive. He needed concrete proof, irrefutable evidence of Eddie's complicity. A calculated risk began to form in his mind, a plan audacious enough to expose the conspiracy. Arthur devised a carefully constructed trap. He confided in Eddie, his seemingly loyal neighbor, that he was planning a midnight security upgrade for his gun room, meticulously detailing the new combination codes and the revised security schedule. He explicitly outlined the times when he would be working alone, vulnerable, and unprotected. If Eddie was indeed collaborating with the criminals, this information would be used to meticulously time their attack, ensuring maximum effectiveness and a guaranteed success. Arthur was essentially using himself as bait, a high-stakes gamble in his personal game of cat and mouse with the criminals. The surveillance equipment Arthur had discreetly installed after discovering Eddie's listening device, a sinister reminder of the betrayal brewing beneath the surface of their friendly neighborly interactions, would provide the answers. It was a cold, metallic eye monitoring every movement, recording every whisper. And the recording proved everything Arthur had suspected to be true. At 2:30 a.m., as Arthur had predicted, his motion sensors were activated. For figures dressed in what appeared to be police uniforms, moved with chilling efficiency towards his property, systematically cutting through his back fence. Their movements were precise, their actions synchronized, a carefully rehearsed maneuver reflecting a military-style precision. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals, trained operatives with the skill and experience to execute a flawlessly coordinated heist. They were masters of deception, moving with the practiced ease of veteran soldiers, expecting to find an unsuspecting, vulnerable old man, an easy target ripe for the taking. What they didn't know, however, was that Arthur wasn't some defenseless old man. He was a seasoned veteran, a man trained in the art of warfare, and he had spent the entire evening meticulously preparing his defenses. He had spent months quietly strengthening his security system, and unbeknownst to the criminals, he had been coordinating with Mrs. Patterson, a formidable woman with a network of vigilant neighbors, who had been documenting Karen's relentless harassment campaign for months. The final layer of Eddie's manipulation unfolded the next morning. He arrived at Arthur's house, feigning concern, his voice dripping with false worry. "Frank," he began, his tone laced with manufactured empathy, "I heard sirens around here last night. Everything okay? You know, with all the valuable stuff you have, maybe it's time to consider some kind of professional security consultation. I know a guy who specializes in protecting collectors from exactly this kind of problem." The sheer nerve of it all was almost breathtaking. Eddie, after orchestrating an attempted robbery, was offering his security services. He was attempting to cast himself as Arthur's protector while simultaneously betraying him to a criminal network, driven by greed and avarice, eager to plunder the tangible symbols of Martha's father's sacrifice. Eddie and his criminal cohorts had utterly underestimated Arthur, a man hardened by years of service, a soldier trained to not just defend, but to counterattack. After 6 months of enduring the insidious manipulation orchestrated by those who had mistaken his grief for weakness, Arthur was ready to unleash his fury. He was ready to show them what decades of military training, seasoned by years of unwavering resolve, could truly accomplish. The next morning, armed with irrefutable evidence, Arthur confronted Eddie. He laid out the listening device and the carefully documented timeline, a chain of evidence that inextricably linked Eddie's betrayal to Karen's relentless harassment. The surveillance footage, crystal clear and undeniable, depicted the synchronized movements of the would-be burglars, their shadowy figures stark against the backdrop of Arthur's property. Arthur waited for Eddie during his usual coffee visit, calmly placing the surveillance equipment on the kitchen table alongside printed screenshots. Each screenshot illustrated a direct correlation between their conversations and the subsequent harassment letters from Karen, precise timing that left no room for doubt. His voice was calm, steady, controlled, the voice of a seasoned commander delivering a critical briefing. "Eddie," he began, his tone devoid of emotion, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about what you've really been doing in my house for the past 6 months." The look on Eddie's face when he saw the listening device was one of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was the stark, chilling realization that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled, his elaborate deception exposed. For a fleeting 10 seconds, he attempted to maintain his friendly neighbor persona, weakly claiming ignorance, suggesting that someone else might have planted the device during one of Karen's visits. His voice trembled, his words betraying his fear. But when Arthur presented the irrefutable evidence, the timeline, the screenshots, the undeniable correlation between their conversations and Karen's actions, something inside Eddie snapped. His carefully cultivated persona, the meticulously constructed mask of deception, shattered like glass under a sledgehammer. The man's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the raw, wounded soul beneath. "You want honesty, Frank?" Eddie exploded, his voice raw with a bitterness Arthur had never witnessed before. "Fine. Yeah, I've been working with Karen in Blackwood. Yeah, I lied about Afghanistan. I never served a day in my life except in county jail for drug possession. While real soldiers were dying overseas, defending people who couldn't care less about veterans once the parades are over." The pain in Eddie's voice, raw and visceral, was undeniably genuine. Even as he confessed to months of manipulation and betrayal, the depth of his suffering was palpable. This wasn't a sociopath playing a calculated game. This was a broken man, a casualty of a system that had forgotten its veterans, leaving families like us to struggle in silence, in the shadows of national amnesia. The bitterness resonated, a deep ache echoing through Arthur's own soul. "Blackwood didn't just offer me money, Frank," Eddie continued, his tears mixing with rage as the carefully constructed walls of his deception came tumbling down. "He offered me respect. He said I was serving military history by helping preserve these artifacts, instead of letting them gather dust in suburban garages, shrines to personal grief. For once in my pathetic life, someone treated me like I mattered in the military community, like I deserved recognition for understanding what sacrifice really means." Arthur felt a sickening twist in his gut. Eddie's pain was real, even if his methods were reprehensible. This wasn't simply a con artist. It was a damaged soul, a product of societal neglect, a man desperately seeking validation in a world that had forgotten his father's sacrifice. His father's service in Vietnam, a chapter marred by the debilitating effects of Agent Orange, was now reduced to a forgotten footnote in the annals of military history. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on Arthur's shoulders. He had focused on his own loss and had failed to see the vast chasm of sorrow that drove his seemingly amicable neighbor to commit such heinous acts. "Son of a bitch," Daniel roared, the word echoing in the cavernous silence of his gunroom. The air hung thick with the scent of gun oil and old leather, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal that coated his tongue. He hadn't wanted this. He'd spent decades painstakingly building a life away from the chaos of his past, a quiet existence filled with the comforting weight of history and the ghosts of loved ones. But now, the ghosts were screaming. His face, etched with the lines of a life lived hard, contorted in a grimace of anger and disbelief. The sobs of Ethan, the man who sat before him, were a soundtrack to the shattering of his carefully constructed peace. Ethan, a man he'd considered a friend, a fellow veteran, was laying bare the depth of a conspiracy that reached far beyond stolen artifacts. It was a plot that exploited the vulnerabilities of grieving men, the gaping wounds left by war, and the sacred legacy of sacrifice. Died alone in a VA hospital, Ethan choked out, his voice cracking with grief. While Beatrice's father, they build him shrines, treat him like a goddamn saint. Where's the justice in that, Frank? He got more love and respect in one lifetime than most see in 10. The irony, it's crushing. His words were a torrent of raw emotion, a flood of resentment and despair. Ethan's sorrow was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on the room. He hadn't just lost a loved one. He'd lost faith in the very system that was supposed to protect them. Daniel understood Ethan's pain. He truly did. He understood the gnawing emptiness of loss, the agonizing weight of unspoken grief, the silent screams that echoed in the lonely chambers of the heart. He'd felt it himself, that hollow ache in his chest, the phantom touch of Martha, his late wife, her absence a constant, agonizing reminder of his loss. But Ethan's pain, while profoundly real, did not excuse 6 months of calculated psychological warfare. 6 months of insidious manipulation, designed to exploit Daniel's vulnerabilities, to steal the one remaining link he had to Martha and her family's military history. 6 months of carefully orchestrated attacks on his most precious memories. His anger doesn't excuse the deliberate cruelty, Daniel muttered, the words barely audible above the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck tight with suppressed fury. The betrayal stung, but it was the cold calculation behind it that truly chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of desperation. This was a meticulously planned operation, a calculated assault on his spirit. Ethan's confession unveiled the insidious machinations of Victor Blackwood, the puppet master pulling the strings of this elaborate scheme. Blackwood, a name that now reeked of treachery and deceit, had meticulously researched Daniel's life, exploiting the hidden cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He delved into veteran crisis forums, uncovering Daniel's darkest hours, his struggles with addiction, his criminal record, a past he'd worked tirelessly to bury. Blackwood had found his weaknesses and used them like precision-guided munitions, targeting his deepest vulnerabilities. He knew exactly what buttons to push. Frank, Ethan confessed, his voice laced with shame and a hint of self-loathing. He told me guys like us, guys who'd seen the real cost of war, understood the value of these things better than those suburban heroes who never faced real hardship. He made me feel like I was doing something important, saving history for those who'd appreciate it, instead of letting sentimental old fools use military artifacts as personal therapy. Ethan's words were a painful echo of Daniel's own internal struggles, the self-doubt that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He, too, had struggled with these feelings, this guilt over preserving a legacy that felt increasingly tainted. But the conversation took a sinister turn, the veiled threat hardening into a chilling ultimatum. The pressure mounted, a ticking clock counting down to a violent confrontation. Karen, the woman at the heart of the conspiracy, was facing foreclosure. Her daughter's medical school tuition, a staggering $80,000, loomed over them, a mountain of debt threatening to crush their already fragile lives. Her ex-husband had left her drowning in credit card debt, a legacy of irresponsibility that threatened to destroy her family's future. Desperate measures, fueled by desperation and driven by the desperation of others, were now their only recourse. "Look, Frank," Ethan pleaded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. "I tried the easy way. I tried to be your friend, convince you to sell voluntarily. But Blackwood, he's losing patience. Karen, she's facing foreclosure if she doesn't deliver soon." The weight of their situation was crushing, a suffocating burden that threatened to break them all. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival. The survival of a family, the survival of a dream, the survival of hope itself. The final threat, delivered with a chilling pretense of concern, was a cruel twist of a knife. "They're coming tomorrow night at 3 a.m. Frank," Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Federal seizure warrants. They'll look official enough in the dark. You can be gone when they arrive, file insurance claims later, or you can be here and see what happens to old men who resist federal agents with proper documentation. My advice? Pack what you can carry and disappear for a few days. By the time you come back, this will all be over. You can start fresh somewhere else, without carrying Martha's ghost around like it's some kind of sacred burden." The threat hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket of fear and uncertainty. Ethan's words, though laced with concern, carried the bitter tang of blackmail. But Daniel wasn't just an old man clinging to the past. He was a soldier, a veteran hardened by years of service, a man who had faced death head-on and emerged victorious. He had spent decades defending his country, and he wasn't about to let a group of criminals use his grief as a weapon against everything he and Martha had built together. Threatening Martha's memory? That was a declaration of war. The artifacts in his gun room weren't just collectibles. They were tangible links to the men who died so families like his could live freely in a society where people were supposed to look out for each other. The Purple Heart, earned on Omaha Beach, wasn't meant to be a trophy to be snatched by criminals wielding fake federal authority and emotional manipulation. It represented a sacrifice, a debt paid in blood and suffering, a legacy of courage and valor that would not be desecrated. These weren't mere objects. They were symbols of the ultimate price paid for freedom and justice. As Ethan left, probably thinking he had won, Daniel felt a surge of icy resolve. This wasn't about material possessions or preserving a family legacy. It was about whether he'd let predators weaponize his grief against everything he and Martha had fought for. He wasn't broken. He was battle-ready. He had 18 hours to transform his gun room from a repository of history into a fortress. And he knew exactly how. He had spent 4 decades learning the art of warfare, of preparing for asymmetric conflict. He would use that knowledge, not to kill, but to defend. His first priority was creating multiple defensive layers, incorporating legitimate security measures that wouldn't tip off any potential surveillance. He began with perimeter early warning systems, motion-activated floodlights positioned to blind anyone approaching from the backyard, the same point where the fence had been tampered with during their reconnaissance. These lights, wired to activate simultaneously, would create disorientation, eliminating the advantage of darkness and surprise. He ensured that these additions appeared as typical home security improvements, a far cry from the tactical preparation they truly represented. The next layer focused on controlling access, funneling potential intruders into predetermined defensive positions, maximizing his advantage. Furniture and equipment were strategically rearranged to create choke points, forcing any attackers into a single corridor of approach, negating any attempts to surround or overwhelm him. Along this route, he deployed non-lethal deterrents, pepper spray dispensers triggered by tripwires, strategically placed obstacles designed to slow their advance, and defensive cover positions offering protection while leaving any attackers exposed. Communication was crucial. He contacted Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor, providing a detailed timeline and emergency contact information. This was to ensure police arrival was perfectly timed, as backup rather than just for a post-incident cleanup. Her network of watchful neighbors positioned themselves as witnesses, their cameras poised to record every detail, prepared to document what they all expected would be a home invasion disguised as a lawful operation. The battle for his home, for Martha's memory, for justice, was about to begin. And Daniel was ready. Holy goddamn shit. That's what I yelled, the sound echoing through the surprisingly well-lit backyard. It wasn't the planned, calm, tactical response I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in my head. But then, nothing ever truly goes according to plan, especially not when you're a 65-year-old man facing down 4 highly trained individuals who think they're untouchable. They were dressed in what looked like authentic tactical gear, the kind only the military or elite law enforcement units possess, complete with vests emblazoned with the insignia of a federal seizure unit. Their presence was unnerving, professional even, and terrifying in its precision. They moved with a practiced ease that spoke volumes about their experience, their expertise honed through years of probably illegal operations. These weren't amateurs, they were predators. The local sheriff's department, specifically Deputy Dale, had been briefed weeks prior. A meticulously crafted plan, developed over months of agonizing preparation and fueled by a grief so profound it still felt like a physical wound, had been put into motion. This wasn't about simple property theft. This was about a targeted attack on everything I had left of my past. My late wife, Martha, had been gone for 8 months, a loss so devastating it threatened to consume me entirely. And the last 6 months had been further poisoned by the slow, insidious realization that someone was orchestrating this, using my grief and vulnerabilities against me. Their aim was not just robbery, but calculated emotional destruction, a sick perversion of justice. This wasn't the first threat. Anonymous phone calls filled with veiled threats, increasingly aggressive harassment, and the growing sense of being watched, all part of an orchestrated campaign of intimidation. I'd initially brushed it off as random occurrences, dismissing them as the ramblings of some disgruntled neighbor or someone seeking to cause mischief. But the escalating intensity, the disturbingly specific details about my daily routine, the sudden increase in seemingly random car accidents near my property, it became impossible to ignore. It was a chilling realization. I was being targeted. The dispatcher, a sharp, efficient woman named Officer Jenny, had been prepped. A carefully worded description of the potential home invasion, the impersonation of federal agents, the highly organized nature of the likely attack, was already on file. This ensured a rapid response and the correct legal classification of whatever followed. But the most crucial preparation wasn't the tactical layout of my property or the strategic placement of surveillance cameras and alarm systems. As important as those were, it was the psychological preparation. I had to steel myself, to prepare myself to potentially inflict harm on individuals who had chosen to violate my sanctuary, to desecrate the memory of Martha's father. The reality was a stark contrast to any notion of heroic readiness. After years of military service, years spent honing my skills on the battlefields of far-off countries, the emotional toll of Martha's illness and death had softened my edges. I had been fighting a different war, a silent battle against grief that dulled my sharp edges and threatened to erode my tactical instincts. But the instinct to protect remained, a primal urge, honed to razor sharpness. Defending my home against these criminals wasn't all that different than defending a combat position. The mission remained the same: neutralize the threat with minimal force while safeguarding what I valued most. At precisely 3:17 a.m., just as my contact, a former colleague from my military days, Eddie, whom I've changed his name here to protect his identity, predicted, 4 figures appeared, cutting through my back fence with an alarming efficiency that suggested professional-grade equipment. Their movements, the military precision of their formation, made my stomach clench. They looked like something out of a high-budget action movie, yet here they were, intent on turning my home into their crime scene. The tactical vests, the official-looking documentation, everything was designed to intimidate, to overwhelm. They clearly believed that the appearance of legitimate government authority would be enough to scare me, a lone elderly man, into submission. It was a tactic they had probably used successfully on countless other unsuspecting victims. But they had underestimated my preparation. The perimeter lighting system activated the instant they breached the fence, blinding them with sudden illumination and negating their night vision advantage. Instead of the dark, silent house they had expected, they found a brightly lit scene, every corner captured by multiple surveillance cameras. This wasn't a surprise. This was a trap. The neighbors, alerted and briefed beforehand, were also observing the situation. My own carefully planned defense, built over weeks of preparation and informed by years of military training, was in full effect. The biggest attacker immediately launched into a torrent of threats, his voice booming with self-assured confidence, spouting legal jargon and threats of seizure. It was a calculated attempt to re-establish psychological control, to break me down with the weight of false authority. It was the same tactic used by countless other criminals. Leverage fear and intimidation to overwhelm your victim's ability to defend themselves. This tactic has been used for centuries, and it is still effective today. Yet, I held my ground, the years of military training kicking in almost instinctively. But here's where my age and physical limitations became a brutal factor. My hands, usually steady and reliable, shook violently with a mixture of adrenaline and the inescapable reality of my age. My breathing grew ragged as I maneuvered, the years taking their toll, leaving me winded far sooner than I had anticipated. Then came the moment of truth, when the largest attacker breached my primary defensive position after I, in my haste, stumbled over some equipment positioned too close to my escape route. I found myself pinned in my gun room, my backup weapon, which I'd relied on in my preparation, jammed due to a simple maintenance oversight. The reality of my situation crashed down. A 65-year-old man, outmatched in strength and speed, facing four younger, stronger opponents with professional training. For 30 agonizing seconds, I faced the terrifying prospect of failure, the terrifying prospect of these criminals succeeding in their vile mission. I could feel the weight of Martha's father's purple heart, a precious artifact, a symbol of sacrifice, hanging in the balance. The physical struggle stripped away any illusion of invincibility, exposing the brutal truth of my vulnerability. This was no movie. It was a genuine life-or-death confrontation, a stark reminder of my mortality. I was about to lose everything I had sworn to protect. But then, salvation arrived in the form of Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, activating the second layer of our security system, the external alarms. The ear-splitting sirens, the flashing lights created chaos, disorienting the attackers, buying me precious time. I managed to recover, to utilize the zip ties I'd strategically positioned as a backup restraint system. But let's be clear, I didn't win this fight through sheer strength or some Hollywood-style heroics. My victory was a testament to community preparation, a testament to a meticulously crafted plan that accounted for my age and limitations. 40 years of military planning, years of learning to anticipate equipment failures and compensate for physical disadvantages when facing younger, stronger opponents. All those lessons converged in those chaotic minutes. Within 15 minutes, the four attackers were securely restrained using military-standard restraint techniques. I was spent, utterly drained, but a quiet satisfaction filled me. The police sirens, approaching from multiple directions, filled the night air with a promise of justice. The attackers' professional-grade equipment, fake federal badges, forged seizure warrants, body cameras containing footage of their prior operations, were photographed and documented as evidence before the authorities arrived. But the real victory was the confession that began to unravel a far larger conspiracy. Under intense questioning, the criminals crumbled, revealing their connections to a woman named Catherine Miller and revealing text messages that pointed to a larger network, a sophisticated operation targeting elderly veterans across multiple states. Catherine Miller paid us $800 apiece. The smallest attacker confessed, his voice barely a whisper, his resolve completely shattered. Eddie Torres, he gave us the floor plans, the security details, told us you'd be alone in the gun room with the new equipment, vulnerable to a quick entry. The text messages on their phones provided irrefutable evidence of coordination with an individual known only as Mr. Black, who had specifically targeted Martha's father's Purple Heart as the final piece in his Normandy collection. This wasn't random theft. This was a meticulously planned campaign aimed at acquiring specific historical artifacts, a crime with a chilling degree of organization and depravity. Deputy Dale, as he reviewed the text messages and the intricate details of the operation, his expression hardened. Mr. Thompson, he stated, his voice grave, this goes far beyond local theft. We're looking at a significant operation, a federal-level crime targeting elderly veterans. Someone is using professional criminals, impersonating federal agents, to steal military artifacts. We need to contact higher authorities immediately. The evidence gathered that night unveiled a disturbing truth. My situation was merely one piece of a much larger criminal puzzle. My act of resistance had inadvertently exposed a complex web of organized crime, an interstate operation with far-reaching implications. It was a terrifying realization. The quiet life I had sought to reclaim after Martha's death had been shattered, replaced by the sudden realization that I had stumbled onto something incredibly dangerous. But even amidst that fear, as I sat in my gun room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my victory, my gaze lingering on Martha's father's Purple Heart, safely secured, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't experienced since Martha's diagnosis. A deep, quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing that I had fought back, that I had defended not only my home, but also the memory of those I loved, and that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. The fight was far from over, but for now, I had won this battle. Holy freaking hell. That was my first thought, the raw, unfiltered rage clawing its way out of my throat as I watched the sun rise on the aftermath. My quiet life, the peaceful routine I'd painstakingly built after Martha's passing, shattered into a million jagged pieces. It wasn't just a robbery. It was a calculated, brutal violation, a desecration of everything sacred. They hadn't just stolen a few trinkets. They'd stolen a piece of my soul, a legacy forged in the fires of war and sacrifice. The silence of the morning only amplified the echoing emptiness in the house. The absence of my father-in-law's Purple Heart, a gaping hole where a precious memory once resided. My heart, normally a steady drumbeat, hammered against my ribs like a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The next morning dawned, the rising sun casting long, accusing shadows across the ransacked rooms. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood, a faint trace from my scuffle with the intruders, and the acrid scent of fear, a ghost of the terror I'd felt. It wasn't just the material loss, though the sheer audacity of their theft was staggering. It was the deliberate targeting of something irreplaceable, something that transcended mere monetary value. It was the chilling realization that my grief, my vulnerability, had been weaponized against me. They'd thought weakness resided in sorrow. They'd underestimated the power of righteous anger. The arrival of the FBI felt like a seismic shift, a sudden surge of hope amidst the wreckage. Agent Grace Carter and her stoic partner, Agent David Reyes, moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of seasoned investigators. Their presence, professional yet empathetic, was a balm to my frayed nerves. They treated my home, not as a mere residence, but as a crime scene of significant proportions, a testament to the scale of the operation they were uncovering. The meticulous cataloging of evidence, the methodical interviews with neighbors, each action spoke volumes about the seriousness of the situation. They weren't just dealing with a typical burglary. This was something far more sinister, far more organized. 6 agonizing hours later, The grim picture started to emerge. Richard Blackwood, the mastermind behind the operation, wasn't just a common thief. He was a meticulous collector, a twisted curator operating a sophisticated criminal network stretching across 5 states. For 8 long years, he'd been systematically targeting elderly veterans, preying on their age, their isolation, and their profound sense of patriotic duty. His methods were chillingly effective, a symphony of intimidation, fraud, and outright theft, netting him an estimated $3 million in stolen artifacts. Agent Carter, her voice devoid of emotion, yet laced with steely resolve, explained Blackwood's twisted ideology during the debriefing. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her gaze unwavering, "you weren't a random target. Blackwood had spent 15 years cultivating what he calls a definitive private museum of World War II artifacts. But his obsession morphed into a criminal enterprise, driven by a warped belief that museums and families were inadequate custodians of American military heritage." She presented me with a thick file, Blackwood's meticulously documented operation. His chilling rationale was laid bare, a testament to his arrogant self-righteousness. He considered private collectors superior guardians of history, justifying his crimes as a necessary evil. The preservation of artifacts, a rescue mission of sorts, to shield them from what he called the emotional compromises of families. He viewed his actions not as theft, but as a form of scholarly stewardship, claiming sentimental attachments hindered proper research and access for future generations. The audacity was breathtaking. The sheer scope of Blackwood's network, depicted in intricate FBI organizational charts, was truly staggering. He built a complex web of accomplices, each with their own specific skills and motivations, carefully crafted to exploit the vulnerabilities of his targets. Karen, for instance, a woman teetering on the brink of financial ruin, played the role of a seemingly sympathetic neighbor and an authority figure, manipulating HOA regulations and fostering community harassment to gradually drive veterans out of their homes. Eddie, a veteran himself, struggling with PTSD and unemployment, used his insider knowledge and psychological manipulation to exploit the victims' emotional vulnerabilities, subtly twisting their sense of patriotism and duty into a tool of coercion. Agent Reyes interjected, adding another layer to the complex tapestry of Blackwood's operation. They weren't just using one tactic, he explained, his voice low and measured. It was an arsenal of manipulation, tailored to each victim's profile. Fake real estate appraisers overvaluing homes to pressure sales, corrupt auction house employees facilitating illicit transactions, even fraudulent VA representatives posing as helpful bureaucrats while secretly inventorying prized possessions for future theft. It was a multifaceted operation, meticulously planned and expertly executed. But what made Blackwood's obsession truly sinister, what chilled me to the bone, was the highly targeted nature of his acquisitions. My father-in-law's Purple Heart wasn't a random choice. The FBI investigation revealed that Blackwood had spent years painstakingly tracing every medal awarded to the 116th Infantry Regiment during the D-Day landings. He had a specific, terrifying goal: to assemble what he termed the definitive Omaha Beach collection, and my father-in-law's medal was, tragically, the final piece. The horrifying truth hit me like a physical blow. Blackwood's actions were driven by more than mere greed. They were fueled by a twisted attempt to rewrite history, to claim a legacy that wasn't his. Agent Carter revealed the most disturbing fact of all. Blackwood's grandfather had perished during the same D-Day operation, tragically dying hours before the Purple Hearts were awarded. Blackwood, consumed by a warped sense of familial justice, saw the acquisition of these medals, particularly those from the 116th Infantry Regiment, not as theft, but as a way to grant his grandfather the recognition he believed was unjustly withheld. He was attempting to right a historical wrong, to claim a familial glory through a profoundly illegal and morally reprehensible act. Agent Reyes showed me a list, each name a testament to Blackwood's systematic approach. 12 other Purple Hearts, obtained through the same cruel tactics of psychological manipulation and legal intimidation. My father-in-law's medal was meant to be the 13th, the final piece of Blackwood's twisted Heroes of Omaha Beach collection. But here's the crucial part, Mr. Harrison, Agent Carter said, her voice sharp with a glimmer of hope. By fighting back, by refusing to surrender, you've provided us with the evidence we need to dismantle his entire operation. Your resistance, your refusal to be a victim, has opened the door to potentially returning every stolen artifact to its rightful owner. The weight of that responsibility, the enormity of the task ahead, settled upon my shoulders. But the fire of righteous anger still burned, providing the fuel to keep fighting for justice. Blackwood's actions extended far beyond simple theft, delving into federal fraud, interstate organized crime, and the creation of sophisticated forgery operations to legitimize his acquisitions, involving corrupt appraisers and auction houses. The fight, I realized, was far from over. The battle for justice had only just begun. "Holy freaking hell," Daniel muttered, the words barely audible above the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in his gunroom. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams, slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the meticulously organized rows of firearms and military memorabilia. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him like a physical burden. It had all started with the brutal attack on his home, a violation that had shaken him to his core, a violation not just of his property, but of his family's legacy. The meticulously crafted plan to legitimize stolen goods, a scheme orchestrated by the ruthless Richard Blackwood, had been exposed, but the aftershocks continued to reverberate. Blackwood, a man who seemed to revel in exploiting the grief of others, had built a criminal empire on the backs of grieving military families, preying on their vulnerability with a chilling efficiency. He not only stolen irreplaceable artifacts, tangible links to the sacrifices made by their loved ones, but it also eroded their sense of honor and connection to their family histories. The audacity of it still burned in Daniel's gut. He considered simply walking away, disappearing into the anonymity of a new life. But the image of those shattered families, the profound loss etched on their faces, had ignited a fire within him, a fire he couldn't ignore. The four men who had stormed his home, posing as federal agents, were just pawns in Blackwood's grand design. They had been part of a rotating cast of professional criminals, each carefully selected for their intimidation tactics and their ability to exploit the trust placed in official authority. They had targeted the elderly, those most susceptible to manipulation and fear. The chilling precision of their actions, the callous disregard for human dignity, had fueled Daniel's determination to bring them to justice. Agent Miller, a seasoned FBI agent whose weary eyes hinted at countless battles fought in the shadows of law enforcement, had handed Daniel a list that held the promise of restitution. A list of 47 families, their cherished artifacts poised for return, thanks to the evidence he'd unwittingly provided in the struggle against Blackwood's operation. Each name on that list represented a family ripped apart, a legacy tarnished, a connection to a lost loved one threatened. The weight of their collective grief was immense, and Daniel felt a surge of responsibility, a profound sense of ownership in their shared struggle. The subsequent court proceedings were a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity. Richard Blackwood, defiant to the end, even dared to suggest his actions were a form of preservation, a misguided attempt to protect American military heritage. His words, spoken with a chilling calm, were an insult to the very notion of sacrifice and honor. The judge, however, was unimpressed by his twisted logic. She recognized Blackwood's systematic targeting of vulnerable veterans during their most emotionally fragile moments as an aggravating factor, thus justifying the maximum sentence under federal organized crime statutes, 12 years. Karen Mitchell, a woman driven by desperation and a misguided desire to secure her daughter's future, received a harsher sentence than Blackwood might have expected. 3 years in state prison and full restitution were her punishment, a reflection of the devastating consequences of her actions. The court heard the heartbreaking testimony of her daughter, Laura, a promising medical student whose future had been jeopardized. The weight of her mother's crimes, the knowledge that her education had been funded through the theft of precious heirlooms, had forced Laura to abandon her dreams. Her emotional testimony, a testament to the far-reaching impact of Blackwood's criminal network, brought tears to the eyes of many in the courtroom. Eddie Torres, another cog in Blackwood's wheel, received a more lenient sentence: 2 years, mandatory therapy, and 1,000 hours of community service at the local VA hospital. Ironically, it was within this very setting, in his service to veterans, that he embarked on a journey of genuine rehabilitation. His redemption lay in atoning for his past, replacing exploitation with selfless service. During the investigation, the FBI uncovered his father's lost military records, documents highlighting a remarkable service career, a career filled with valor and heroism previously hidden in bureaucratic chaos. The revelation of his father's distinguished service, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, helped mend his broken relationship with his father's legacy. The 4 men who had attacked Daniel's home, the fake federal agents, faced 18 months each, their careers in private security and military contracting irrevocably shattered. But the victory wasn't just about individual sentences. The impact of Daniel's actions stretched far beyond the courtroom. A federal task force, formed on the foundation of the evidence he provided, recovered over 200 stolen military artifacts, restoring lost connections between families and the heroes they honored. Agent Clark's call informing Daniel of the return of the last item, a World War I Medal of Honor, was a poignant reminder of the scope of the operation. The positive changes within Daniel's community were both tangible and transformative. Mrs. Patterson, a woman who had witnessed firsthand the vulnerability of military families, was elected HOA president, her first official act being the implementation of a military heritage protection clause. An annual fund was established to support military families in need. And Daniel, once seen as a recluse, now found himself at the heart of his community, hosting monthly military history presentations. His personal healing journey was intertwined with his newfound role as community protector and educator. He adopted Eddie's abandoned German Shepherd, a loyal companion named Buddy. He joined a grief support group, finding solace and strength in shared experiences. And unexpectedly, he began a relationship with Mrs. Patterson's sister, Margaret, their shared heritage and mutual respect forming a solid foundation for their budding romance. The gun room, once a sanctuary of personal grief, was reborn as an informal community military museum. Martha's father's Purple Heart and M1 Garand, symbols of sacrifice and resilience, took their rightful place, surrounded by historical artifacts and narratives that brought the past to life. The annual Frank Morrison Military Heritage Day became a powerful reminder of the importance of remembrance and respect, connecting veterans across generations and inspiring children to appreciate the cost of freedom. The Veteran Collection Protection Act, a direct result of Daniel's courageous stand, became a landmark piece of legislation. The Franks Law, as it was affectionately called within veteran communities, mandated background checks and federal oversight for anyone claiming government authority to seize military artifacts. It was a testament to the power of one man's refusal to back down, a legacy forged in the crucible of grief and strengthened by a burning commitment to justice. The fight had chosen him, and in fighting, he had not only protected his family's legacy, but had also become a beacon of hope and a champion for countless others. "Holy freaking hellfire," Elias muttered, staring at the newly arrived letter. The sheer audacity of it all still clawed at his throat, a bitter taste mirroring the bile rising in his stomach. 6 months. 6 months since the sentencing of the weasel they called Blackwood. 6 months since the weight of his actions, the weight of their actions, had finally begun to lift. 6 months of tentative peace, shattered now by this unsettling correspondence from Agent Davies. The letter, crisp and official, laid out the details in stark, unforgiving prose. It wasn't merely an update. It was a testament to the far-reaching consequences of his and his late wife's unwavering fight. Elias traced the elegant script with a trembling finger, the ink a stark contrast to the tremor in his hand. 12 states. 12 more investigations inspired by their case. 12 more criminal rings uncovered, targeting those same vulnerable elderly veterans, exploiting their grief, their fading memories, their hard-earned pride. They hadn't just robbed these men and women of their finances. They'd stolen their heritage, their legacies, the very essence of their identities. They'd preyed on the very heart of their patriotism. The thought sent a fresh wave of icy fury through Elias. His knuckles, normally calloused from years of working the land, whitened as he clenched his fist. He'd never sought this fight, never wanted to be thrust in the spotlight. He just wanted a quiet life, a peaceful retirement spent tending his garden and reminiscing with Martha about their lives, their shared memories. But the insidious nature of Blackwood's crimes, the blatant disregard for the sacrifices made by these selfless veterans, had ignited a fire in him that refused to be extinguished. Agent Davies's words painted a grim picture. Psychological manipulation, carefully crafted schemes designed to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of grieving veterans. She detailed instances of forged documents, manufactured identities, stolen medals, and even manipulated wills. The victims, mostly men and women in their twilight years, were left bewildered and heartbroken, stripped of their savings and dignity. The letter spoke of complex investigations, painstaking efforts to trace the sprawling networks, and the tireless work of investigators piecing together a puzzle of deceit and betrayal. A wave of nausea washed over Elias. He leaned heavily against the oak table, his gun room's comforting familiarity offering little solace. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the carefully displayed collection of weapons, each a testament to his military career. He remembered the meticulous cleaning, the oiling, the unwavering dedication to maintaining these instruments of precision. Now, however, the weapons seemed heavy, almost oppressive, symbols not of warfare, but of the battles fought and won, battles that shouldn't have been necessary. The annual neighborhood military heritage celebration loomed. He could already picture the vibrant scene. Children's faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight as they listened to stories of D-Day bravery, families sharing their own tales of service, of sacrifice, of pride. He'd always valued these gatherings, these moments of shared history and remembrance. But this year, the weight of Agent Davies' words added an extra layer of significance. He thought of Martha, his beloved wife, her image as clear as if she stood right beside him. She'd been the driving force behind their investigation, her belief in justice unwavering, even in her final days. He recalled her words, her gentle but firm insistence that those medals weren't just relics of a bygone era, but were symbols of enduring values, emblems of what's worth defending, teaching tools that transcended generations. Her father's Purple Heart, a treasured family heirloom, was more than just a memento. It was a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made and the lessons learned. They thought grief made me weak, Elias whispered, the words echoing in the quiet gun room. But grief, he continued, his voice gathering strength, forged my resolve. It fueled my determination to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He had been a soldier, a protector, a guardian. He'd spent 40 years honing his skills, learning to anticipate threats, to assess risks, to act decisively. Retirement hadn't changed that. It had simply shifted the battlefield. He'd traded the harsh realities of combat for the subtle, insidious battle against those who preyed on the vulnerable. He was now a warrior of a different kind, his weapons sharpened not by steel, but by dogged determination and the unwavering support of his community. The neighborhood celebration was more than just a community event. It was a celebration of resilience, of shared memory, and of the enduring strength of the human spirit. The children, their eyes wide with wonder as they listened to stories of heroism, represented the future, a future worth protecting, a future that depended on remembering the sacrifices of those who came before. The families gathered, sharing their own military stories, symbolized the interconnectedness of their community, the bonds forged through shared experiences, and a collective determination to stand against injustice. They had become his family, his support system, his allies in the fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Elias knew he had a role to play. His work wasn't done. The fight for justice was ongoing, a relentless pursuit of accountability and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who had given so much. It was a fight he had not sought out, but now he would continue to fight it with every ounce of strength he had left, with the memory of Martha and the weight of the hundreds of military families he had protected, inspiring him toward every victory. The fight would be long, but he would not falter. He was a soldier, after all, and soldiers never truly retire. They simply choose their battles with more precision, more determination, and more unwavering justice.